Hi, welcome back to my channel. I guess this is inevitable. This is a reaction video to the Pewdiepie video on how he is using Linux. The reason being is that I have admitted in a video, it's probably the most popular video on my channel so far, that I use Windows as my main programming environment. Yes, I also have a YouTube channel, and therefore I feel that if I don't post something like this, YouTube will literally just flick me into this fiery pit and black hole of unreachable content and just irrelevancy. So, despite if what I want to or not, I feel that maybe sometimes you have to try to ride the coattails of the content giants and see what comes out of it. So, before I get off in this treacherous journey, I will pause to bring back the sea otter, the kind of the unofficial mascot of this channel. And with that, I will move on to the actual commentary. So I did see the video, watched some parts of it, and ultimately it is fine. If you looked at my video on Windows, it's one of those things where I don't necessarily have any problem with people using the tools that they find best for them. The whole point of me using Windows is that I actually like it for various reasons. It allowed me to do certain things in my career that I really enjoyed, and I deal with the workarounds fairly well enough that it doesn't bother me so much that I want to switch. And some people feel completely different, and that's fine. I just noted there that for programmers that, shutting yourself off completely from this environment might, cut off some opportunities that might be very good for you. And in the current job environment, that might be not the best idea. But it's certainly one of those things where it's not to the point where it's saying it's like, well, Windows, yes, Windows is good enough, but it's not saying it's the best by any stretch of the imagination, nor that you should, use anything else if you'd like. Now, I was a bit surprised that someone with that amount of presence on YouTube, that's not necessarily in the kind of programming or like coder space, came out and said he was using Linux. I was definitely out of left field, but that's actually great. It's started a lot of amazing discussion, and so that's fine. Now, it'd be tempting for me to stop the video here, but I won't. I mean, there's some things I do have to point out that I feel that maybe got glossed over a little bit. One is that the learning curve. It's one of those things where, as he should, he presented his environment and what was going on after he had set it up and done all the things. And to his credit, it's one of those things where he enjoyed that part of it. And so overall, I accept more that, oh, well, this, he really liked that, and that was good for, and that's part of how he was advocating for it. That being said, that learning curve cannot be dismissed when you're talking to everybody or people in general about switching. When you're having those discussions, there's a lot of choices you have to make when you're going over to Linux. That's just period, point blank. The whole point behind the project is that you have those choices. There are choices to be had. And that's why people use those environments. If their choices weren't there, they wouldn't use them. So there is that. It's one of those things where I was also surprised about how minimal of a, file window manager you ended up using. That was kind of cool. Very old school in that kind of regard. And so that was fun. And not only that, but it's one of those things where obviously, in terms of gaming, there's a lot of people that are putting a lot of effort, the Steam people and other folks, into being able to run DirectX and other Windows games in the Linux environment. And that's awesome. So, okay. Going on from this, though, what would I have as to say here that that isn't kind of retread those types of things? Well, first of all, one might point out is like, well, what did you think of his criticisms about Windows? And he said it's like, well, one of the things that really stuck about it is like he likes how much less nagging there is. Well, yeah, there is more nagging in Windows. There's just no question about that. I'm not going to even try to argue that point. It would just be kind of one of those things where it's fine. I'm not going to even just point out I'll quickly point out the opposite of that, of course, is like as power user, especially in Linux. Once you pass a certain threshold, you can blow your foot off. You can just basically end up in a place where you're starting from basically scratch in terms of resetting up your environment if you're not careful. But there's guardrails in place to prevent that, and there's more things that are around it that are fine. The thing about it that I want to point out, and this is what the interesting point is I want to make is that a lot of people are like, well, this is going to bring, will this bring the desktop on Linux? Will this really flip a lot of people over to Linux, get more people trying it? It certainly might, right? And one of the things that people would be like, well, as a Windows users, are you worried? No. Microsoft does have this tendency to be, when it's backed into the corner, at least try to compete. And it's certainly one of those things where, again, they assimilate certain features of other operating systems and things and adapt when needed be. And so if they need to do certain things that are better in terms of the environment for power users, they do so. And they have. One of the interesting asides is that I'll point out is that they recently made a number of changes to Windows in terms of development that do make a huge difference if you know how to use them. And all those features are Windows features that are targeted for people that are not only developers, but really are TypeScript developers, that are people that are using Node. The vast majority of people that benefited from all these optimizations that they added into dev mode and the dev drives and all this kind of stuff were really targeted around a very specific set of developers that increasingly Microsoft are using. And one of those things about it is that, those developers have to use Windows, and they finally figured out, hey, this needs to get fixed. And, that makes it great. If you haven't looked at enabling dev mode, and not only that, but how to make a dev drive and how to tell, basically how to tell that it's a dev drive and what it does in terms of using the resilient file system, and also that by telling Windows Defender to calm down and not necessarily try to get all the files scanned all at once, is really interesting. And that's basically what this comes down to is that Node and other types of package managers, but especially Node, can just flame the operating system with a ton of little teeny little files, and that can just screw up any sort of security environment. And of course, as people would note out, it's like, well, you don't have to run these types of things in Linux and Mac OS, and that's absolutely true. So I'm glad that those changes are being made in Windows, and the more the merrier, I say. So, but getting back to this point, the thing about it is what's really interesting is that I've talked to some people that work in Microsoft in the past and have worked in Windows, and the amount that they have to do to support customers in terms of backwards compatibility is absolutely astounding. And it's one of those things where if any other operating system had to bring on that base, right, with that level of backwards compatibility, it wouldn't happen because it would just be too dang difficult. And so the question would be like, okay, well, what if we just brought the people in now? And the thing about it is that, well, you're not going to get a certain amount of people unless you can run certain types of stuff. It's one of those things where there's all these little programs that you're going to have to come into that basically people will be like, oh, well, it should work with Windows or should work with Mac OS. They're not going to get it working on another thing. It's like, grandma's got it, your aunt has a circuit cutter, right? The software runs on Mac, Windows and Mac OS. It used to be back in the old days, it only run on Windows, right? Well, guess what? She also has a 25-year-old shareware print shop thing that she uses all the time, and she would desperately hate for it not to be able to install, and dragged in her son-in-law to make sure it gets installed. But the Microsoft people, because they've committed to the backwards compatibility there, it actually will run and install, right? Some cases it doesn't, some cases it's hopeless. But you'd be shocked at the many times that it works. And then its use in the environment, in the enterprise environment, the stuff they have to come out there to get that to work is just crazy. Does that make Windows better? No, actually, it kind of actually makes it, in some cases, especially for power users, worse. Again, we have to have a built-in, we have to deal with antivirus scannings. We have to deal with all these security types of issues. We have to deal with the nags, right? We have to deal with the fact that the browser will go off and say, you're downloading this random program, for example, Dr. Racket, and I don't think that's on the list of things that are commonly downloaded. Are you really sure you want to do this? Make me go through the steps to do this. Grr, right? But thankfully, it's one of those things where they've also got it so that winget works. I can actually go off and go to PowerShell and say, just winget this for me, please. And I'm like, oh, look, I guess you're a power user running in a shell. You really want to install this? And I'm like, yes, I actually want to do, even though it's the same dang exe, right? See, I hate Windows just as much as the next guy sometime. But the thing about it is that if Linux or Mac OS even had the number of users and the number of use cases that Windows has, I think there's a very good argument that people would be running to FreeBSD or another operating system as a power user, because that version of Linux or that version of Mac OS would be just as bad or even worse than what Windows is now. because I don't think it would have certainly an amount of operational and organizational expertise in about how you deal with things like that amount of stuff running on that amount of machines, and B, just the financial resources aren't there either. It's one of those things where it's one of those things that Microsoft is making it so that they can kind of get away with charging enterprises for this kind of stuff, and hopefully getting some people to do it on the Windows side. If you had to do this all in the open source market, it would just be impossible. And that would mean that you would have to finance this operating system to a level that would make it either, like, I think on the Apple side, it would be a completely closed environment where you're basically everything that you wanted to download would either be on the App Store, or you'd have to go through an incredible amount of convoluted workarounds to get it to be compiled and installed. And that, things like Homebrew would be increasingly shrink and would be increasingly less used for certain types of things. Or it would go and be the same thing on Linux, except it would just be, it'd be a package manager, not necessarily the like an Apple store, but you would be increasingly, and I think that's the case right now with Linux, is that increasingly to get certain software on an environment, you really need to install it from the package manager, and you can't just go grab the tarball and go make install like you used to. Certainly a lot of programs that you can do that, but a lot of programs where you can't. And so beware what you ask for in terms of success if you are a power user on these operating systems, because you might get it. And even getting like twice the users in those bases might end up having them to do compromises like, oh, because we don't want to cause a massive security denial of service botnet because we didn't do things like, oh, dang it, now we actually have to do things like antivirus scanners and stuff like that. Well, that might be what would happen. And, let us Windows people deal with it, let Windows have the vast majority of users, and let the power users have the power they want without the responsibility, so to speak. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.